Hi everyone and welcome back. Now you've probably heard people claim that Australia is a corporation, and honestly I understand why. When you look back at what our governments actually did in 1973 with the Royal Style and Titles Act, and then again in 1986 with the Australia Act, those changes were obviously very real. Those alterations were structural and they reshaped our entire constitutional identity. And don't forget, it was all done without a referendum. We had no say in it. We absolutely should have, but instead, those transformations were pushed through quietly, on the sly, by legislation. Now that's not a conspiracy, this is what's written into the Acts of Parliament. So when you understand exactly what was done back then, and you know that governments were willing to make changes that were so significant without asking us, without consulting the people, then it's obviously quite natural to wonder, were there any other mechanisms? What else has been done that maybe we didn't really know about? Whether it be something that's legal, whether it's corporate, whether it's administrative, that's changed how Australia operates today. Now that's what we're going to look at in this video. We're not interested in the rumours, we're not interested in opinions, fantasies and any of that sort of stuff, no conspiracies, just the facts, line by line, and that's how we're going to win. As soon as we start drifting away from the facts and listening to hearsay, well, we're done. Credibility's gone, and we can't change anything if we have our facts wrong. So let's go in deep and let's look at what Australia actually is. Let's look at what Australia is not as well. Let's look at whether any part of our government has been structured, intentionally or not, to function like a corporation. You'll make a decision at the end of the video, because if there's any truth to that idea, we're going to find it. So now, before we get into what Australia actually is, we need to talk about why people even believe this idea in the first place. Because it doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's not just dreamt up. People aren't stupid. They're quite obviously responding to things that look, sound and behave like corporations or like corporate structures. So let's lay them out clearly. First, government departments have obviously got ABNs. If you search the Australian Business Register, you're going to see ABNs for the Australian Taxation Office. You're going to see an ABN for the Department of Treasury. You're going to see it for the AEC, the Electoral Commission. Even the Commonwealth of Australia itself has got an ABN. Now, I guess to the average person, that looks exactly like a company entry, okay? They see an ABN and they assume, well, hang on, guys, it's an Australian business number. So the government itself must be a business, must be a corporation. And I think it's a logical conclusion, even though it's not quite the full story. Secondly, we've got DUNS numbers. The DUNS numbers are used to identify companies internationally. And yeah, many Australian government departments do have the DUNS numbers as well. That doesn't mean that they are corporations, but it's because they interact with the global financial system itself. But still, to the public, it does raise some questions. It looks strange because, again, it looks like corporate registration. See, Australian government entities appear in SEC databases as well. Now, this one definitely shocks a lot of people. The United States SEC database, which normally lists public companies, also lists certain Australian government entities. Not because Australia is registered as a corporation, but because government bonds and financial instruments pass through those reporting systems. But to normal Australians who aren't financial lawyers or international accountants, they see this and they go, well, why is my government showing up in a corporate database overseas? Yeah, why does it look like this is a business listing over here? It's another understandable question. Statutory authorities are literally structured like corporations, and I think that this in itself is a big one. In Australia, we've got ASIC, APRA, the Reserve Bank, NBN, Australia Post, state-owned corporations. We've got government business enterprises, and many of these are created by statute. They're given body corporate status. They're allowed to operate commercially. They're required to act like independent legal entities. The legislation itself literally uses phrases like shall be a body corporate with perpetual succession. That's the same language used for corporations. So when people say Australia is a corporation, what they're actually reacting to, more realistically, is that large sections of our government have actually been corporatized. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Australia moved towards a new public management model. And government departments started using directors, chief executives, boards, performance reporting, service agreements, efficiency dividends, commercial frameworks. So if you read the acts, they sound like corporate charters. They don't sound like public institutions. Again, this gives the impression of a corporate government. And next, people find the 1973 and the 1986 changes suspicious, and rightly so. People see the 1973 Royal Style and Titles Act, the creation of the Queen of Australia, the 1986 Australia Acts, the removal of appeals to the Privy Council, the final severing from the UK Crown. And they think, well, was this some kind of deeper restructure? Was it a conversion? A switch from monarchy to corporate administration? So these questions I don't think are stupid. They're legitimate questions caused by real historical events. And when governments never come out in the open and transparently expose the changes properly and pass them quietly through Parliament without referendum, well, they're going to leave a vacuum for speculation. And that's not the people's fault, that's the government's fault. So when you put all of this together, ABNs, DUNS numbers, SEC listings, corporate style statutory authorities, corporatized departments, structural changes that occurred in 73 and 86, and a complete lack of transparency, it's completely understandable why some Australians look at this and say, this does not feel like a traditional government. It feels corporate. And that's exactly why we need to break this down really clearly so that we can understand it, so that we can separate what looks corporate or what might be corporatized from what is actually true. So yeah, there's plenty of things that make Australia look or feel like a corporation. But before we jump to any conclusions, there's only one question that actually really matters here. Do any of these corporate-looking features mean that Australia as a nation is legally a corporation? Or is something else going on? Have we missed something? Because we need to be precise here, I believe. An ABN itself doesn't necessarily automatically make something a business. Neither does a DUNS number. It doesn't prove incorporation. An SEC listing doesn't mean ownership. A statutory authority that acts like a corporation isn't the same thing as a nation actually becoming one. So to answer this properly, without rumours, without guesswork, without playing into or dismissing anyone's beliefs, we have to break it down into three separate layers, or three separate levels. What does the Constitution say Australia is? That's the first layer. This is the legal foundation. This is the actual document the country's built on. And the second layer is what does Australian statute law say? Because governments do create entities, bodies, corporate and statutory authorities. So we need to distinguish between the nation, the government, and the administrative machinery that the government creates, because they're not the same thing. And the third layer is how Australia is recognised overseas, internationally, under international law, especially the Vienna Convention. A corporation and a sovereign state are not the same in any universe. So we need to look at how treaties define Australia, how the UN classifies Australia, how other countries recognise Australia, how international law treats Australia, and whether a sovereign state can actually even be a corporation. This matters because most of the online debate, or any of those arguments that you might see, they tend to mix the three layers together and treat them as if they're one and the same, but they're not. Australia can have departments with ABNs, it can operate statutory bodies as entities appear in financial systems and engage in international commerce and corporatize administration and still not be a corporation as a nation state. But at the same time, Australia can be structured in a way that behaves like a corporation at the administrative level, even if it's not one legally. And that distinction is where almost every online argument falls apart. So, what is Australia legally? That's what we're going to talk about. What is Australia structurally? Because it's not the same thing. One answers the corporation rumour, the other answers why the rumour exists at all. And when you see those two things clearly, the whole debate starts to make sense. So in the eyes of its own constitution, in the eyes of international law, what is Australia? No matter how many ABNs appear online, no matter how many statutory authorities look like companies, and no matter how strange the 1973-1986 changes were, there's one thing that is absolutely not in dispute. Australia is a sovereign nation state, full stop. It's not a corporation. It's not a commercial entity. It's not a listed company. Now, how do we know this? How can we be certain about this? Because under international law, a corporation is created when it's registered with a corporate registrar. It has shareholders. It issues stock. It can be bought, sold, or even dissolved. It operates under corporate legislation. A sovereign state is absolutely recognised when it has a constitution, when it has a defined territory, when it has a permanent population, when it has an independent government, and when it can enter treaties. It's recognised by other states. It can't be bought or sold, and Australia meets every condition of a sovereign state. That's the bottom line. It meets none of the conditions of a corporation, not even one. So Australia isn't registered as a company with ASIC or with the SEC. You will not find a certificate of incorporation. You will not find a constitution lodged under corporate law, shareholders, directors, voting stock, company resolutions. None of that actually exists because it cannot exist. A sovereign state is not eligible to register as a company either. Even when government agencies appear in financial databases, they are listed as sovereign entities, not corporate entities. That's a massive difference. See, the Australian Constitution defines the Commonwealth as a political union, not a corporation. The Constitution of Australia, the 1901 document, still in force today, says this very, very clearly. Very simple. Anyone can read the Constitution. It establishes a parliament, an executive, a judiciary, legislative powers, state relationships, the Crown as the constitutional head. Not a board, not shareholders, not a corporate charter. Nothing in the Constitution resembles the legal structure of a corporation. The High Court's confirmed Australia's sovereign status. There's been many High Court rulings that have affirmed that the Commonwealth is a sovereign constitutional entity. It's not a corporation, it's not a business, not a private legal person. Now this is just straight black letter law. Australia enters treaties. Corporations cannot do that. Corporations cannot sign defence alliances. They can't join the UN. They can't form extradition agreements or recognise other countries, make maritime boundary treaties, or issue passports. Australia does all of these because it is a nation state. No corporation on earth can do any of that. Australia cannot be bought. It cannot be sold or dissolved. If Australia was a company, well then theoretically China could come in and buy us. The US could merge with us. We could be delisted, or the shareholders could just wind us up. Well, none of that is legally possible. Can't be done. Because a sovereign state is not property. It is not for sale. It is not a commercial asset. So legally, the corporation theory has already collapsed. I'm not saying that because people are stupid, but because corporations and nation states are just legally incompatible categories. Under Australian constitutional law, under UK common law, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, the Montevideo convention, international recognition. Australia is a sovereign state. It's not a corporation, not a commercial entity, not a business enterprise. And that's the end of that legal question. But just because it's the end of the legal question doesn't mean it's the end of the structural question. Because even if Australia is not a corporation legally, parts of the government have absolutely been corporatised. And that right there is the real story everyone has been, let's say, circling around. Now that we've established what Australia legally is today, we need to talk about something that's just as important. How did we get to this point? And why do so many Australians feel something shifted somewhere in the 70s, 80s, 90s? Because I don't believe anyone's imagining it. Something absolutely did shift. The confusion around Australia's identity comes from the two first major legislative changes: the 1973 Royal Style and Titles Act, the 1986 Australia Act. These two events didn't turn Australia into a corporation, but what they did was reshape the constitutional identity of the Commonwealth in ways that most Australians have never actually been told or understood. Before 1973, Australia's crown was equal to the crown of the United Kingdom. But after 1973, Australia's crown is now its own independent crown, the Queen of Australia. This was a substantive constitutional shift passed purely through Parliament, with no referendum, no vote, no consent from the people. The legal identity of the crown, the very foundation of our constitutional structure, was just rebranded, renamed, retitled through legislation. It's not illegal to do that, but it's definitely constitutionally questionable because Section 128 requires a referendum for constitutional change. And let's be honest, if you change the identity of the crown, you're not making just some minor adjustment, you're altering the foundation of the entire system. See, if 1973 was the rebrand, 1986 was the complete severance. The Australia Act ended all of the UK legislative power over Australia, ended all appeals to the Privy Council, terminated the UK's ability to advise the monarch on Australian matters, made state parliaments fully sovereign within Australia, made the Governor-General independent of the UK Crown. And again, no referendum at all. Instead, state and federal politicians, with the Queen's assent, they managed to do it through legislation. Whether you think that's valid or not, the key point is these acts fundamentally reshaped Australia's constitutional order without the people being consulted, without them being asked. And that alone is enough to fuel some level of distrust, because the Constitution doesn't belong to the government. It belongs to the people. Changes of this scale should have required a referendum, without a doubt. But they didn't get one. Not in 1973 and not in 1986, just happened. So even if you can't explain the technicalities, Australians have felt for decades that the link to the Crown is not the same, that it's weakened, that sovereignty's moved inward, that bureaucracy's grown stronger, and that accountability is basically decreased. Governments have become more corporate in tone and behaviour. Democratic power felt more symbolic than real, and they're right. Because structurally, after 1986, Australia became fully self-governing, but without a public vote on how that self-government was going to be arranged. Like I said earlier, this wasn't actually illegal, but was it democratically legitimate? That's my question, and it's a legitimate question. In any case, these changes did not turn Australia into a corporation. Keeps coming back to that. But they did do something else. They created an environment where the Crown became Australianised, the executive became centralised, bureaucracy became entrenched, statutory bodies gained enormous power, and Parliament became the ultimate authority. Constitutional tradition weakened, and administrative corporatisation could spread under the radar. That's why the corporation theory exists. It's not because Australia is a corporation, it's because governments made major constitutional changes through ordinary legislation and then built a corporatised administrative state on the top of it. That is the real issue. That's the fact. We now know that legally Australia is not a corporation, and 1973 and 1986 structurally reshaped the system without a referendum. So we can finally answer the big question. Why is it that so many Australians feel like we're living under a corporate government? Why does the whole system look, act and sound like a giant company? Well, I think the answer just comes back to one simple word: corporatization. The 1990s, early 2000s, new public management quietly transforms government. This was the biggest administrative shift that none of us really know about. It replaced traditional public service principles with corporate management structures, business-style efficiency models, KPIs, executive salaries, departmental clients, performance, metrics, competition policies. Public servants just became executives. Departments became agencies. Citizens became customers. None of this was a conspiracy. It was official policy adopted by both of the major parties. Surprise, surprise. But it did change the culture of government completely. So statutory authorities were designed to operate like corporations. This is where the corporate feel just becomes unavoidable. Australia's got over 100 major statutory bodies: ASIC, APRA, ATO, NBN, Australia Post, CSIRO, ABC. We've got Vic Roads in Victoria, water corporations, energy corporations. These are created by legislation, given body corporate status, granted perpetual succession. They're able to enter into contracts. Sometimes they're able to sue or even be sued. They're often run by boards and CEOs, and that's textbook corporate structure. So they're not companies, but they are corporate entities, and they operate independently of voters. Government departments were obviously given ABNs. This is where the public clearly gets thrown off, because we all know that ABNs are supposed to be for businesses, right? But under new public management, all government agencies were forced to adopt business identifying numbers, commercial accounting standards, international reporting frameworks. This was never explained to the public. It was internal administrative reform. But the result is that everyday Australians who see an ABN think exactly what anyone would think. This looks to me like a business. This is a system design problem. It's not a conspiracy. So why do the government entities appear in Dun & Bradstreet or in the SEC databases or in international procurement systems or global financial registries? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It's because the government does go and issue bonds, financial instruments, international contracts, and those systems just require registration. It's necessary, just like a company does. Again, this is not evidence of incorporation, but it's definitely evidence of corporatization. So the executive government became managerial as well, not governmental anymore. After 1986, with no external crown overseeing everything, fewer constitutional constraints and a rapidly expanding bureaucracy, well, the culture shifted. Ministers became portfolio managers. Departments became service providers. Policy became product, and consultants became strategic advisors. Budgets became investment frameworks. This is corporate language because the public sector adopted corporate ideology. And once again, the people had no say in it and they never voted for it. See, bureaucrats gained power that used to belong to elected officials. That's how it used to be. See, corporatised governance doesn't just change structure, it changes who holds the power. In a corporation, executives run operations. The board oversees the strategy. Shareholders have distant, limited influence. And in corporatised government, senior bureaucrats run the operations. Boards and statutory authorities oversee the functions, and voters have the distant limited influence. It's not that Australia is a corporation, it's that Australia's government behaves like one, while still having the taxation and coercive power of a state. So that combination is what feels wrong. If the reforms of the 70s, of the 1980s, 1990s and the early 2000s had been actually put before the people for a referendum, well, Australians would have actually had a say in how their country was structured. But they weren't given that opportunity. So people start looking at the corporatised agencies, the ABNs, the bureaucracy, the managerial government, the lack of accountability, no transparency, the increasing separation between the government and the people. And they connect the dots the only way that makes sense to them. This feels to me like a corporation. Doesn't feel like a democracy. And in a way, they're right. Not legally, but structurally. Not as a nation, but as a system. Not in a conspiratorial sense, but in a policy-driven administrative sense. And now we can finally bring it all home. So if Australia isn't a corporation legally, and it isn't a traditional Westminster system anymore structurally, then what exactly is it? We're not a corporation, we've learnt that much. Legally, that theory does not stand. There are no shareholders, there's no company registration, there's no commercial charter, there's no corporate ownership, and that part basically closes that argument. But the reason this debate exists is obviously because Australians can feel that something is wrong, something deeper is going on here. And the system does not behave like a traditional constitutional democracy anymore. And they're absolutely right. We know what happened in 1973. The identity of the Crown was rewritten through legislation without a referendum. 1986, Australia's final constitutional ties was severed with the UK, again without referendum. Then in the 1990s, the 2000s, the entire public sector was remodelled into a corporate-style bureaucracy with ABNs, with boards, with CEOs and business lingo. None of this actually made Australia a corporation on paper, but it did create a government that absolutely behaves like a corporation, that manages itself like a corporation, it's shielded from voters like a corporation, and expands like a corporation without any of the checks and balances that exist in a real marketplace. And that is the truth that nobody really explains. So Australia is a sovereign nation state with a corporatised administrative government sitting on top of it. A government that the people never voted to restructure. A government that grew more powerful, Westminster traditions eroded. A government that became more executive driven, more bureaucratic and more commercially aligned as democratic accountability faded into the background. And when you combine all of that, it's no wonder Australians look at the system and say, this doesn't feel like the same country that it was when I was growing up. And they are 100% right when they say it. Because the real issue was never, is Australia a corporation? The real issue is Australia's government has been restructured to operate like a corporation without the consent of the people and without the accountability of a real democracy. And that's the part, unfortunately, nobody talks about. Not the media, they're not talking about it in universities, politicians aren't talking about it, experts. But I think it matters because a country that behaves like a corporation will always prioritise bureaucracy, management, and economic frameworks over transparency, sovereignty, and the will of the people. And until Australians understand exactly how the system was reshaped and who reshaped it, and what powers they now hold, we will forever be confused by the symptoms and will never address the actual cause. Australia isn't a corporation, but the people running it are operating a corporatised system that the public never voted for, and that is the real problem. And I think until we actually confront this fact, nothing's ever going to change. Doesn't matter. No elections, promises, budgets, slogans. They're not going to change anything because you can't fix a system that you don't fully understand or that you don't even know about. But now we do. And this conversation is just beginning. So I really appreciate you watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, chuck a comment in below, turn on the notification bell so that you get notified when I put out new videos. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one.